Hi everyone, I'm here today with Charlotte Christensen, also known as the London Wine Girl, and we're here to talk about wine and fragrance and how the two are linked together, which is really exciting. So thank you for joining us, Charlotte. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. I am really delighted to
Okay.
talk about wine and perfume today. I think they're a very interesting two topics and they are linked, as you say, and we'll talk a little bit
Absolutely.
more about that shortly. So I run wine events in London and a bit further afield, and I also work with wine regions and wine brands, generally communicating with different types of consumers, either in exciting consumer events, and I do a lot of work on social media as well. So quite a lot of broad communication work in wine.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds really fascinating. I have to say that I am a complete newbie to the whole world of wine, but not fragrance. So I'm really interested to find out a little bit more about how the two do link together and how taste and smell, are so linked.
You'll probably see how good you are at smelling the aromas and wines, having had your fragrance
Yes,
background. You're going to
I
surprise
hope
yourself, I'm
so.
sure.
Well, fingers crossed, and that's it. So I'm really intrigued to find out a little bit more about this. So yeah, I mean, obviously you've got wine in front of you, and I have got wine next to me as well. So I'm excited to get tasting.
So we have today a rosé from Provence, and then we have a Chardonnay that's got a little bit of oak on it. And then we also have a red Rioja, which again has a little bit of oak on it. But three quite different wines, and three different wines that people can quite easily get hold of at home, in local wine merchants, or on different sorts of supermarkets. So we're going to have a little smell of these and see if we can pick up on similar aromas and try and think a bit about the connection between these types of aromas we're getting in our wines and also in perfume as well. I think one of the things that's really interesting about wine is when you come to it as a beginner, you think that wine is a lot about taste and what it's like once you take a sip. But actually, so much of it is about smell. One
Mm.
of the things that I found so interesting is that smell and taste are incredibly connected, and actually they say that 80% of what you taste is actually governed by smell.
That's so interesting, and it is so true as well, isn't it? I mean, there is it's if you don't like something, and then you would hold your nose. If you didn't like it, just because of the taste and how it is linked. It's really interesting.
Exactly, yeah. When you think back to being a
Mm,
child and there's something you didn't want to eat, you'd hold your nose and then it would be much
exactly.
easier to get it down. But just like fragrance is very evocative of certain flowers or
Mm,
incenses and things like that as well, wine is very similar like that too. And
sure.
wine, like a fragrance, can transport you to different places, can make you feel nostalgic, just like all sorts of different perfumes and smells that you might have encountered in your life.
Exactly, because I know I'm the same with fragrance. I'll have fragrances for different times of the year, and whatever mood I'm in. And yeah, it's exactly the same for wine, I'm sure.
I was going to begin by talking a little bit about the different types of aromas that we get in wines. So
Mm,
generally, when we talk about aromas in wines, there are three categories of different types of aromas we get. We get aromas that arise naturally from the fermentation process, so converting the grape juice into alcohol.
right.
Then we get different aromas from the actual winemaking techniques that the winemaker will use in the winery. And then we get different aromas from when the wine has begun to age in the bottle. And even though it's been bottled maybe 1 or 2 years ago, it might be a wine that can last for 5 or 10 years. And as it rests in the bottle, it begins to develop different aromas and flavors because it's an organic product.
Sure.
So it changes over time, which is really interesting.
I see.
Just,
I see.
yeah, very interesting. And I think that's one of the things
Fascinating.
that people sometimes forget is that it doesn't just have a snapshot of 1 second. It will actually continue to develop and evolve over time. Some of the aromas that we get from fermentation are ones you might have heard people discussing before. These are often kind of fruity aromas that we get. So the smell of green fruit or citrus fruit or red fruit or tropical fruit, or some of
Mhm.
those kind of herbaceous or grassy or spicy type notes.
Yeah.
So when we come to smell the wines in a second, we'll try and pick out some of those. And then when we talk about aromas we get from winemaking, these might be aromas from certain yeasts or acids that come about during the winemaking, and these can have buttery or doughy type aromas. And then aromas that are often quite easy to pick up or quite apparent to pick up are those from different types of oak being used in the winemaking. Now, oak is a really complex subject in its own right, and there's lots of different types of barrels that winemakers can use from lots of different types of oak. The two kind of most used are French oak and American oak. American oak often imparting kind of coconut and vanilla flavors. We'll be able to smell that on one of the wines. And then French oak typically being a little bit more restrained and giving some sort of spice and sweet cedar notes.
See, that's so interesting, because I just wouldn't have thought that oak from different parts of the world would even make such a difference to the actual flavour. So
absolutely. Wow. And then when you get really geeky and really into it, they have all different types of toasting of the oak, for example, which affect how differently those oak aromas impart on the wine, and how old the oak is as well. So it's very interesting. Wow. And then as wine begins to age, as I just mentioned just before, we also have different aromas that start to develop. So in white wines, if it's a type of white wine that can age, it might develop kind of honey notes or nutty notes or apricot, dried apricot type notes. And then with red wines, they often start to develop more cooked fruit flavors, like cooked blackberries or dried fruits like prunes, or they develop kind of earthy and leathery notes.
I mean, it's funny how similar, and it's really making me think of fragrance, because in, you know, a similar way with fragrance on the skin and how that dries down, and the different layers of fragrance and then different notes that you will then pick up on, you know, throughout just wearing a fragrance out the course of a day or an evening. So it's strangely similar in that sense. Absolutely.
Shall we give our wines a bit of a smell?
Let's absolutely do that. Brilliant. Looking forward to it.
Give their wine glasses a little bit of a swirl like this.
I will do the same. I have got my wine here.
Do you know why people do this?
I'm going to say it's to release the aromas, but that could...
Exactly. You're allowing for more oxygen contact with the wine.
Okay, lovely. So, like that. By holding the stem, am I holding it?
What we try and do is hold the stem a little bit lower so we don't heat up the wine too much. Yeah, that's a good swirl. I like it.
A good swirl. There we go.
I don't know if you often give your wine a smell before having a taste.
I can't say that I do. Normally I'm a bit keen to start drinking it. Excited to try something different, and you know.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So let's give this first one a smell.
Oh, okay.
So this is a rosé from Provence in the south of France.
Smells... I'm getting sort of, I want to say honey, but I could be totally wrong, but that's just sort of what I'm picking up at the beginning. Or
I think there is definitely a sweet floral note to it, like honeysuckle. So what's interesting about rosé is that it's made from red grapes that have contact with the skin for a short while. So the skin is where we get a lot of the aromas and flavors for wine. So you might pick up on some similar notes that you would get in red wine, but they will be much more subdued and much fresher. So for me on the rosé, I do get some red berry fruit, which would be typical from red grapes, but it's very delicate. So I kind of get like light raspberry.
Yes, I'm definitely getting that. It's very crisp.
It definitely encapsulates that southern French, sort of by the sea, sitting out with a lovely meal with friends in the sunshine. I think there's some really pretty kind of blossom and floral notes coming through on there as well.
Yes, definitely.
But something also quite lifted as well, keeping it feeling really fresh. So I think something not quite like a lemon, but something a bit more like a ripe grapefruit, because it's not super sour, but there's something citrusy there.
Yeah.
That just more. I think ripe grapefruit is where I'd go with it.
I would definitely agree with that. As somebody who doesn't have too much experience with wines, I can certainly, get those aromas pulling through. It's really lovely.
Is there any particular fragrance that this rosé reminds you of?
So this really reminds me of the Lancôme Trésor de Nuit, which is actually one of my favourite fragrances. It's really sparkling, fruity scent, perfect for summer. It's strangely reminded me of that. And actually I have got it on today as well, so maybe it's a mix of both, but they seem to be going together very nicely. And I would also say that the Lady Million Lucky is another really, lovely, sparkling, fruity fragrance, which would go very nicely with this. I can't stop smelling it.
I know, it smells very appetizing, doesn't it?
It really does.
And that's what the smell of wine should do. It should make you, salivate and anticipate going in there for the first sip.
Yes, definitely.
So it is so much part of the pleasure of drinking.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. It's so interesting to put the two together, for sure.
So shall we move on to our second wine now?
Yep, let's move on.
So the second wine we have is a Chardonnay from Columbia Valley in Washington State in America. So perhaps not a region you've had Chardonnay from before, but no. I think this will convert you.
I hope so. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not overly familiar with all the different wine regions, but Washington wouldn't be the first place that I would think of. It would be more sort of, France and New Zealand, those sorts of places.
Exactly. I mean, Chardonnay actually is grown pretty much all over the world now.
Wow.
It's one of the grapes that is fairly easy to grow in lots of different climates. So it's time to experiment. So this is going to have quite a different profile from the rosé.
Right.
So it's had some time in oak barrels, and I'll be interested to see if you can pick up on any of the oaky characteristics I was talking about a little bit earlier. So some of those vanilla-y or slight sweet cedar or slight spicy notes.
Okay, yeah, I'm hoping I'm doing my swirl. I feel like I'm just automatically doing the swirling now.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I definitely get those spicy, woody notes. Absolutely, that's really interesting in comparison to the rosé before, how different that actually is. Once you actually have two wines, in front of you, you can really,
yes.
It's really interesting.
So, oak can divide people on white wine. Some people really love a nice kind of buttery, oaky style of white wine, whereas other people prefer something much sort of leaner, more fruit-driven, more mineral-driven.
Right.
I personally think there's a time and a place for both, but I just thought it was something to mention because people have differing views on what they think about oak.
I think this smells absolutely delicious. And it's very aromatic almost in the way that it smells. And you really do get that cedar through as well, which is actually a really common ingredient in a lot of fragrances. So actually being able to pick that up is quite interesting. It's something that I wouldn't have noticed before.
With Chardonnay, something that's a lot of people don't often realise is that because Chardonnay is grown all over the world and in lots of different regions, it can have a very different profile depending on where it's grown. So in certain places like Chablis, for example, where it's quite a cool climate, it won't get as ripe as, for instance, over in California. So in terms of its aroma profile, it will be much more on the green fruit, citrus, lemon type of aroma profile, and typically doesn't see any oak. So
right.
Definitely is quite a different style of Chardonnay to then moving over to warmer places like some parts of California where there's more sun and the grapes get much riper and develop more tropical fruit notes. And then if they have that coupled with the oak, they definitely have a hugely different profile to a cooler climate Chardonnay that doesn't see any.
Oh, that's so interesting. So then what would make those in those two different wines from two different climates a Chardonnay as opposed to a different type of white wine? So a Sauvignon Blanc or something like, would it be the grapes, or is there something else for those who might not know?
Practicing drinking them regularly would be one of the things that decipher it. But yeah, I think one of the things that would be different between a Chardonnay and a Sauvignon Blanc, for example, is Sauvignon Blanc is extremely aromatic. It has often quite herbaceous or grassy aromas that literally jump right out at you. Whereas Chardonnay is not as aromatic. And yeah, in places like Chablis, it shows much more of a kind of subdued aroma profile. So some of those nice lemon and apple notes, but lots of different things to do with the acid and things like that also separate out the two wines.
I see. I'm going to give it another smell. And there's certainly a couple of fragrances that are springing to mind that remind me of
it feels quite warm, doesn't it, when you smell
yeah,
it?
It does. It's really warm. And it's making me think of Marc Jacobs Daisy Days.
Lovely.
And Nina Ricci at Nina as well, which actually is just a gorgeous fragrance. And it's got some of those similar notes that really come through. And it's very warm and very sort of sensual sort of feeling that comes through.
So it's definitely not as fruity as the rosé. I think
no.
Some of those oaky notes are quite apparent, but I don't think they're overwhelming. I think they smell really appetizing. They actually make me want to have like a nice main course meal, I don't know, like roast chicken or something.
Yes, I was going to say, actually, what sort of food would you recommend with this type of wine?
Oh, definitely roast chicken with all the trimmings.
Yes. Okay, so we're moving on to the third wine now.
Our red wine.
Yes, the red wine. I've got that here as well.
So this is a Rioja from Spain, and this also has some contact with oak, and I think it's American oak here, so we should get quite pronounced vanilla-y or slightly coconutty notes. It's made from a grape called Tempranillo, which often has a fruity but also kind of savoury character as well. So you might pick up on some dark fruit or red fruit character, as well as something a little bit more savoury like tomato leaf or kind of fresh tobacco leaves. Give it a smell and see what you think.
Oh, I'm getting the vanilla straight. Yeah, absolutely. It's very deep.
Yeah, it definitely smells kind of rich, doesn't it?
It really
get
does.
That kind of layered aroma profile. For me, it smells like a freshly baked berry tart. Like there's something that has a kind of cooked pastry.
I can really get that. Yeah, there's definitely the notes of berry in there that are coming through. Oh, it's lovely. Oh, I just want to take a sip.
Well, you can and see how it relates.
Well, I might.
And then you should try taking a sip holding your nose to see how much more powerful it is before and after holding your nose.
Okay, well, I'll try that and try not to spill it down myself at the same time. Oh, you really get more of the earthy notes. I don't know if earthy is the right word, but it tastes different. That's really interesting.
It is really interesting because the tongue only picks up certain senses. So the tongue will pick up salt, sweetness, bitterness, and umami, and also sourness, but it won't pick up all the kind of complex nuances. That's when the nose comes into play and kind of colours that. So it just picks up those kind of 5 key components.
Yeah, because it did taste a little bit more bitter, but but not in a bad way, because I always think you associate bitter with, you know, actually a negative sort of taste, but actually it wasn't at all. It just changed the flavour, but in a really nice way. Okay, so I have a question. So depending on the type of fragrance that you like, what sort of wine would you go for? So for example, if you like a more of an oriental fragrance, what sort of wine would you suggest going for?
Interesting. Okay, so I've got 3 different fragrances in my mind. The first one is a fragrance for people who like them kind of light and fresh and kind of citrusy and clean and mineral. This would take me to certain white wines that have a very similar profile. So very fresh white wines like Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio.
Okay.
Or Albarino. So those wines are all very fresh, very clean, very citrus driven. So I would pair those with those types of fragrances. And then for fragrance lovers who prefer more of a sweeter aromatic, maybe more of a honeyed profile with, a little bit more of that sweet fruit there, I would go again with certain white wines, but with maybe slightly richer or sweeter white wines, like one in particular that I'm a huge fan of, somewhat difficult to pronounce, is Gewürztraminer. Very sweet notes of rose and Turkish delight and kind of gentle spices. Really, really beautiful wine. Really great with Thai food. Or things like an off-dry Chenin Blanc or an off-dry Riesling. Again, these start to have a little bit sweeter notes. So those would go well with people who prefer slightly more aromatic and sweeter fragrances. And then for those who like fragrances that are maybe a bit more earthy and woody, with more of a kind of
some men's fragrances.
Yeah. Or actually, I seem to go for fragrances that have a little bit more of a kind of exotic or oriental kind of incense to them, that I suppose a bit less sweet and a bit more on that kind of spicy Middle Eastern market, that kind of
anything with, you know, maybe oud as one of the ingredients in fragrance.
Exactly.
Really common at the moment. Yeah, and that's fantastic. And actually, I'm really drawn to those sorts of fragrances myself as well.
Okay. So if you're drawn to those fragrances, I would go probably down the red wine route. And
I do.
In particular, I would go for a grape called Syrah, which is also known in Australia as Shiraz, which again can have quite aromatic, kind of perfumed, violety, smoky type aromas, more evocative of incense than, say, you know, your Sauvignon Blanc, for example. So something like a Syrah would be a good match for people who like
Syrah,
those incensey, oudy type of perfumes.
That's really interesting, and that's something that I wouldn't have known before. And like I said, I'm really drawn to those types of fragrances, even in like home scents and, you know, fragrances that I wear. So it's nice to be able to find a wine to match that. That's amazing. So going back to the Rioja that we have here, I'm just giving it another smell because I can't help myself.
It's pretty delicious.
It is lovely. I might take another sip. Yeah, some fragrances that do spring to mind just from the notes that I'm getting from this wine. I'm getting Burberry Intense. I'm really getting notes of that, and also Gucci Guilty Absolute, which is a really distinctive fragrance. I would call this quite distinctive. I mean, especially in comparison to the others that we've smelled earlier. It's very distinctive. It's very almost like a signature scent. And it also, some of the notes are making me think of some men's fragrances as well. So there's Diesel Only the Brave Street, and that springs to mind as well. It's very warming, the spices that I'm getting out of that.
Lovely. Yeah, it's definitely got a warm, spicy kind of profile to it as well, doesn't it?
It really does. It'd be perfect in those winter months, and it's a rainy day today.
Exactly. So perfectly suitable for this afternoon.
It absolutely is. Wow. That's absolutely, yeah, it's amazing that you link fragrance and wine together so well. And actually they are very much in the similar vein of how you would, you know, wear a fragrance and taste a wine. And how those notes do evolve over time. It's really interesting. At the beginning, I think you briefly mentioned about the pleasure that you can get from smelling wine and tasting it, and you know how that works with fragrance as well, because I know that obviously you know the main reason people would wear fragrance is to get that pleasure from, you know, smelling it and other people being able to smell it on you. So how would you say that sort of, you know, relates together?
So much pleasure that we get from wine is from the aroma. After we have a look at wine, the aroma is the first kind of main sense that is evoked before we taste it. And I mentioned earlier as well that actually 80% of what we taste is governed by smell. So when you look at it like that, the smell is absolutely so important to wine. Smell can also give us lots of clues about wine, which is also really interesting. It can give us an indication of what grape it might be made from. It can also tell us potentially how old the wine is. If we start to smell some of those more developed or cooked fruit type notes, we might know that it's a slightly older wine than if it shows more of a fresh fruit profile, we'll know it's slightly younger. And it can also give us an indication of where it comes from in the world. Generally, wines that are from the old world, so that's basically Europe, might have a lot more of a restrained, fruity profile, whereas wines from the New World, so Australia, South Africa, parts of the US, are often places that are a bit warmer than in Europe, and they can show much riper fruit profile, so fruits that really jump out of the glass. So yeah, there's lots of different clues that smell can give us before we've even had a taste, all about the grapes, how old it is, where it's from, which I think is really, really interesting.
That is really interesting. And like I said, you know, I didn't know anything really about wine to begin with, other than I like drinking it. But actually being able to smell it and drink it in a different way and get a different appreciation for it has been absolutely fascinating. And like you say, you know, there's so much that you can tell about wine. In the same way you can tell a lot about a person from the fragrance that they wear. You can do the same thing through just actually taking a moment to sit back and smell the wine. It's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. All of your insights have been so interesting, and just to take a step back and view wine in a very different way, in a way that is similar to fragrance, has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you at home as well, if you would like to drop a note in the comments about your favourite wines and any notes that have been similar to fragrances that you love, we would love to hear about it. So please do let us know. And thanks for joining us. And thank you very much, Charlotte. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.